So I'm going to demonstrate how to take the little pattern that you have cut out of a brief. So I've got the front piece and I've got the back piece cut out. You can tell the difference because the back piece has got a lot more fullness where the seat is. So this is the area you want to make sure that your elastic fits in nicely. So depending upon the type of leg, whether you have a very high rise leg or a low rise leg will determine how much you want to have in here as far as elastic, whether you want it in fairly flat to just sit across your seat, or if you want it in a little snugger so that it actually cups under the fullness of your seat. So the other little piece we have is the gusset, and this is just a lining, swimsuit lining fabric. Another great thing you can use if you've got old t-shirts that are there's still some areas that are good in them, just a cotton t-shirt actually, you could take and use, cut your gusset piece out of this. So this goes right into the crotch. It just adds a little extra padding or lining in that area. So the first thing you want to do is you want to take your front crotch, which is this part down here, this narrow part, and you want to put the back crotch piece, so line those two up so that they match. And I'm going to put a pin in here because I'm going to have my hands moving around quite a bit. So you want to line them up so that they line up from end to end. Now you're going to take your piece of lining and you're going to take, there is a right and wrong side to it. So you're going to put the right side of that piece of lining against the wrong side of the back piece of your crotch. So I'm going to put a pin in here. I'm going to leave that one in the middle because I'll pull it out when I get to it. So there's my pieces. You can see that there's the back. Okay. If I turn this over, there's the front. It's narrower to accommodate the front part of your leg. So I've set my serger or my sewing machine up here. You can definitely do this on the serger much faster. I'm doing it on the sewing machine just to show you. Now my seam allowances for this are 1/4 of an inch. If you have 5/8 of an inch, then you stitch on that 5/8 line and you will be trimming off because you don't want a lot of extra bulk. I have, this particular pattern has a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I'm going to place this in here and I'm going to start to sew my stitch here. So I'm sewing across that little piece where the crotch goes. I'm using an overlock stitch. So on my machine here, it's actually running a bit of a straight stitch and then into my seam to overlock the two edges. So come to the end, cut my thread, and there you can see my seam. So now I'm going to clip these threads at the beginning off. I'm going to take just the crotch piece and I'm going to fold it towards the front. Okay. So you see what's happened now is that seam that we've sewn together is now inside, it's enclosed. Now my crotch piece here is just a tad bit smaller. It could have been, maybe I cut something a little bit bigger. I don't usually worry about this because this has the elastic sewn on and everything is going to end up being nice and secure. But what I like to do, just to make this piece a little bit more manageable, is I now want to go to my stitches and I'm going to switch it to a zigzag stitch. And I'm going to get it to a fairly good size stitch. And I'm just going to zigzag this edge down. So you can see that I've taken and I've zigzagged that edge. So I'm going to do the other side. Now it's going to be off a little I'm not going to worry. I am going to make sure that I catch the lining. And got it there, my thread. And I tried to take this out before I cut, so all right. So I'm just gonna cut that off. Now, what I like to make sure of is that this curve here, where these two, where the back and the front join, is fairly smooth. So if it isn't, I just take my scissors and I just kind of neaten it up here. As long as you're not taking off more than about 1/8 of an inch, you're okay. So you see it's all nice and smooth there. Okay, so now what I need to do is I need to sew the sides of my little brief here. So I'm going to sew the side seams down, making sure that they line up, and I'm going to go back to my stretch stitch here in just a second. Okay, we're back in business. So I'm going to take this side seam, I'm going to go back and find the stitch here that I used for the crotch, because it's going to work out just fine. And I'm going to sew my side seam. So remember, 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. So I'm just come to the end here, and I will address, actually, if you take a look at that, when I fold that seam back, you see that my side here is nice and smooth. So I'm just going to do the other side. And I like to start, if I start at the top of the back on one, I want to start the top on the other side. Kind of like the directional sewing. If you sew, when you sew your pants together, you always start at the hem on both outseam and inseam and work up. So with any seams, it's always better if you can sew your vertical seams all in the same direction. So either sewing all your vertical seams from top to bottom, or all your vertical seams from bottom to top. Okay, so now I've got these little briefs all ready. So we're ready to put the elastic in. So for the elastic in the legs, you may have a guide with your pattern that tells you how much elastic you need to cut. I don't pay a lot of attention to that. I will take a look at it. I will maybe take my elastic, and if I've got a length that it says, I'll put maybe a pin or a chalk mark there, just so that I know. Now for this leg, if you've sewn it up correctly, you will need a 15-inch piece of elastic to go in the back. So I'm just going to mark off 15 inches here, and I'm going to do it with chalk just so I can see it. Now, when you're working on a leg, you want to start and do the front first. That's the easiest area to sew first. So you're going to lay your elastic down so that it lines up with the edge of your fabric. Okay, so you see my edges are lined up here. Now I'm going to switch back to a zigzag, and I'm going to do I'm going to zigzag at just a little over 3 millimeters long. What you want to do for this zigzag is you don't want to zigzag on the outer edge. You actually want to keep the elastic lined up with the outer edge, but you want to zigzag on the inner edge. So you want your thread to actually hit on the inside edge of this piece. So when you do the front, You don't pull it. You basically lay it. I'm holding it with a little bit of resistance, but not a lot. I'm sort of taking my bottom and laying it down on top, or laying it down underneath, and just making sure that neither one is stretching. I'm not stretching the leg of the brief. I'm not stretching the elastic. I'm giving the elastic a little, not a stretch, but I'm just holding it taut. Okay, so now I take and I get it positioned for about 4 inches, and then I start to zigzag so that I can make sure as I'm sewing, my one hand is kind of keeping the elastic lined up with the edge here. Now if you've got a thread or a seam guide that you can butt up against there, that would definitely be helpful. So then I go for a little bit of a distance, and then I lay this down again on top, and I stitch some more. Once I get to the side, I will show you. Now you see here when I am coming up to the side, I've got a little bit of a gap here. So if I had a serger, I know it would cut this off, but because I don't have the serger, I'm just going to even that up there, and I'm going to have my seam go towards the back. So I'm still just giving it a little bit of, I'm holding the elastic with a bit of taut in it, and I'm making sure that this edge is staying along the edge of my seam. I'm just about at the side seam. So I'm going to stop with my needle in the down position so you can see there is my, let's see if I can bring my camera a little closer. So you can see I've used blue thread here. I've caught it on the edge. This is the outside edge, so this is all still loose. But we're going to fix that in a few minutes, okay? So now when I come to the back of my brief, I kind of take my thread or my elastic, and I want to give it a little bit more of a tug, okay? So I'm looking at where that 15 inches is here. So if I kind of match that up with my front, and this is where a free arm is definitely helpful. So now I can kind of tug this. Now actually I feel like that's going to be a little bit too much. So instead of being 15 inches, I'm backing it off by about 3/4 of an inch to an inch here. And I'm going to carry on, but now I'm pulling this elastic. So it's a little tougher in the back to kind of, now you kind of almost wish you had 3 hands. So you want to be able to keep sewing on that outer edge, keep this here so that your elastic and your edge of your fabric are lined up. Now I'm using a braided elastic, so remember, braided elastic, as you pull it, it gets smaller, okay? So you shouldn't be yanking this too much. If you're having to yank it too much, you don't have enough elastic in the leg. It's going to be too bunched up, and you're not going to have a nice even seam. So I'm just keeping here, trying to keep this so that it stays on the edge. And now what I found, because I backed off, now when I actually come back and I can actually line up this elastic at that 15-inch mark. So I'm just making sure that I pull things where I need to so that the outer edge is lined up. So I'm going to overlap this piece by about 1/2 inch. So I'm just going to go across at 1/2 inch. I'm going to back stitch it, take it off here. If you don't overlap by enough, what happens is when you cut it, you'll end up with a gap down here. So this is, I don't want a lot of bulk, because remember, this is the crotch part. So this is going to go between your legs. So you don't want a lot of bulk down here with a lot of elastic. So now you can see, there's my back. See how it's nice and evenly gathered. And there's my front. So it's fairly flat. There's a little bit of the curve that has a little bit of gathering, but very minimal. The elastic is pretty well sitting flat on the fabric. Now when you go to do the next leg, because remember, you want to do the front first. It's just much easier to get through the front. So you're going to put your elastic at the side seam here. And I like to push my side seam to the back. So I'm going to sort of start right on the side seam. And I'm starting on the inside of the elastic, keeping this so that I'm not pulling it, but I'm keeping it taut. My fabric underneath is just kind of laying there. And you want to catch, you don't want to go, you want to make sure you're trying to keep your zigzag on the elastic. If you go into the fabric, what happens is when we turn this over and do the top stitching on it, you're going to see that zigzag. There might be an area here where I can actually show you. So I'm just, like I say, just keeping this laying flat, lining it up against this edge. So keep going till you get to the crotch seam here now. So I've got my needle down. So now I'm going to take this piece of elastic again. Now I didn't mark this, which was not smart. I should have marked it, because now if you go to do this one and I say I don't pull it enough, I could end up with looser elastic in one side. So always remember to mark your elastic to at least the two pieces to the same length, whether you end up making them both shorter, but that will remind you how give you a good indication as to the length of those pieces of elastic, that they're going to be the same. So I'm going to give this a tug, because we're now at the seat where I want to have. So remember, I'm not pulling it, I'm not overstretching it. I am giving it a good stretch, but I'm not stretching it really, really far. So just trying, and you got to go slow on this. This is an application that you almost have to do quite a few before you start to get the feel of the fabric, the elastic, where you want to go with it. So you see I'm having a lot of trouble here keeping this elastic over. So I need to slow down. And part of it's because I didn't mark this, so now I'm sort of overcompensating with where I'm stretching, and I'm just kind of trying not to make a mess of it. Okay, so I've overlapped this by that 1/2 inch there. I'm going to cut this off. So there's the leg elastic in both my legs. Now I'm just going to take this and kind of see whether I was even or not. And actually I can see where I've stretched this one a little more than I stretched the original one. So there again, that's why you want to make sure that you mark both sides of your elastic. So even if you go like mark this at 15 inches, and how to tell if it's not this little brief and it's your bathing suit. You want to measure the edge of your opening here. If your pattern hasn't had any alterations, you can do it right on your pattern. So you want to measure this edge, and then you want to take your elastic and you basically want to take it from your side seam and kind of just sort of pull it over so that it goes on an angle from the side to the crotch seam. Okay, so if this was opened up, this would actually be going, let me see if I can, it would kind of be going over you would see it a little bit shorter. Okay, so generally the back is depending on your size. So the bigger the opening, the greater, or the greater the lesser, more elastic stretch in the back. So if for this little brief, it's probably about 1.5 inches difference from the actual edge. On a bigger leg, it might be 2. It might even go up to 3 inches. The front should measure roughly the same. Maybe you can subtract 1/2 inch. Okay. So now I'm ready to top stitch. So I'm going to go back to just a regular zigzag. So I'm going to put this at 3. So now I'm going to take, and I've got my leg here, and I'm flipping this edge over. And I'm going to actually now be sewing, so I'm catching the edge of the other edge of the elastic to the brief. And I don't backstitch when I start, because I don't like a lot of stitches in the crotch. I like to have it look a little smoother. So now what you have to do is, as you're stitching this, and your thread is going, so I'm going to do another little fix here. Okay, so back in business. So you can see where I've started to sew along this edge. There's the top stitching on the right side. So I'm just going to carry on. Generally, I don't like to start and stop with a crotch seam, just because, or a top stitching, because you can see where you start and stop. So again, this is just going to take learning how to hold the fabric. So you see how you've got a bit of a mess here, and you'd be kind of like, okay, how do I get this straight? So what you want to do is you want to hold your brief with your left hand and take your right hand with your elastic and just stretch it out so it lays smoothly. So I'm not overstretching, I'm just stretching that elastic so that it's going to lay smooth. And then I'm going to carry on, keep sewing. You'll notice when you come to the back, you're going to have to stretch the back to get it to lay smooth. Otherwise, you're going to be stitching, and you're going to stitch all kinds of little gathers and pleats in here. So I'm just going to take and keep this nice and flat. And by keeping it flat, I'm pulling this edge so that the edge of the fabric is going right against the inside edge of the elastic. Okay, so come back to the start. And I did miss a little there. I didn't pay attention where I was stopping, but you'll see. So here is my top stitch brief here. So you can see, even though I kept this nice and flat, there is still a bit of gathering up here, which is fine. This is what's going to hold the leg so that it's not gaping open at the top of your thigh. And then here I am on the back. So everything, I don't have any tucks or pleats. My zigzags kind of went right in between all of the extra fullness there. But if I pull it, you can see how it lays nice and flat. Okay, so practice with this. It does take a bit of practice. And another thing to remember too is, if you're making something really small, you may want to only use 1/4 inch elastic in the legs, or the neck, or the armhole, wherever you're putting it. I've got 3/8 inch here, but you may want to, if it's just for a child or something, you may want to only use 1/4 inch elastic. It just makes it lay in a little smoother. Now by doing that, you have to make the accommodation across the crotch here, because if you're only turning this over 1/4 of an inch instead of 3/8, you're actually leaving this wider. So then this area will become too bulky between their legs, and it'll end up puckering up, and it looks like they're too big. So this is an area where you would want to narrow this on your pattern before you actually do all of the stitching. Okay.